Every business I ever built ran on one principle, and I taught it to every manager who ever worked under me. A title is not a control. You can call someone a director, a supervisor, a manager, and none of those words do a single day's work protecting you. What protects you is the person actually checking the numbers, on a schedule, without warning, regardless of how much you trust the person whose numbers they are. I spent 34 years running an import logistics company on that exact principle, drilled it into every operations meeting I ever chaired, and then I retired, handed my own business director full signatory authority, and stopped checking. I want to walk you through exactly how a man who understood this rule better than almost anyone I've ever met still managed to break it in his own company, because I think the mechanism matters more than the outrage, and because I've had a great deal of time now to work out precisely where the structure failed. I'm Australian, 63, and I spent most of my working life building an import logistics operation out of Melbourne that moved goods between Southeast Asia and the Australian East Coast. Container freight, customs brokerage, warehousing, the unglamorous plumbing that keeps retail shelves stocked without anyone ever thinking about it. I built that business from a single truck and a fax machine in 1991 into something that, by the time I sold it, employed 41 people and turned over more money in a good quarter than my father, a builder, had earned across his entire working life. I sold the Melbourne operation for a figure that, after tax and after the earn-out clause finished paying, left me with 720,000 Australian dollars in liquid assets, and absolutely no idea what to do with the 30 years of habits that had built it. My first wife used to say, not unkindly, that I ran our household the way I ran a warehouse floor, and she wasn't entirely wrong. I reconciled our joint account every month without fail for 18 years of marriage, not out of suspicion but out of habit, the same way you'd check a stock count regardless of whether you expected a discrepancy. She found it exhausting toward the end, I think, that same instinct that had built the business slowly starting to feel, in a marriage, less like diligence and more like an unwillingness to simply trust another person without verification. We divorced amicably enough in my early 50s. No children involved, and I mention it here only because I think it's relevant to what came later. Because the one domain where I had, for years, applied exactly the scrutiny I built my career on, was the one relationship where that scrutiny eventually wore something down, and I suspect some part of me, arriving in Thailand a widower of sorts to that marriage, was quietly relieved to finally build something where I didn't have to be the one checking every column of every ledger by hand. Retirement, for a certain kind of man, is less a rest than a vacuum, and I filled mine the way I suspect a lot of men in logistics fill it, which is by starting another version of the same business somewhere the margins looked more interesting. Thailand had been part of my supply chain for over a decade before I ever properly considered living there. I'd flown into Bangkok dozens of times to inspect warehouses, negotiate with freight forwarders, sit across tables from Thai customs brokers who knew the regulations better than I ever would. I understood the industry there. I understood, or believed I understood, the mechanics of how goods moved through that particular part of the world. And when I decided, at 59, to set up a smaller import operation of my own, out of the Lat Krabang logistics district near Bangkok's old airport, it did not feel like a leap into the unknown. It felt like moving into a house I'd already walked through 100 times. I hired Supawati 18 months into that operation, and I want to be precise about how that hiring happened, because I think precision is the only honest way to tell this story. She was 33, already working as an operations manager for a competing freight forwarder in the same district, and I recruited her deliberately, poaching her with a salary increase and a title upgrade, because in 11 separate meetings across 2 years of dealing with her previous employer, she had been, without question, the sharpest operational mind I encountered in that entire industry cluster. She understood supplier relationships the way I understood them. She could read a shipping manifest and spot an inconsistency in under a minute. The kind of skill you can't really teach. The kind you either have or you don't. When I offered her the director role 8 months after hiring her, full signatory authority on the business accounts, it wasn't sentiment driving the decision. It was, by every metric I'd ever used to evaluate a hire in 34 years, the correct call. I remember the specific meeting where I offered her the promotion, because I'd prepared for it the way I'd have prepared for any significant capital decision. A list, drawn up over several evenings, of every reason the promotion made structural sense. She had reduced our customs clearance delays by an average of 2.5 days within her first 6 months. She had renegotiated 3 separate supplier contracts on terms meaningfully better than the ones I'd inherited or negotiated myself. She asked. In that meeting, remarkably few questions about salary, and remarkably many about the scope of the signatory authority itself, which I noted at the time, and noted approvingly, as evidence of someone taking the responsibility of the role seriously, rather than simply chasing the title. I have thought about that specific detail more than almost any other since, because I no longer know whether it was evidence of seriousness or evidence of exactly the opposite, and I suspect I will never fully resolve which reading was correct. I want to pause on that decision, because I think it's the hinge the entire story turns on, and because I've turned it over more times in the last year than any other single choice in my working life. The mistake wasn't hiring her. The mistake wasn't even promoting her. The mistake was in what I believed the promotion itself accomplished. I had spent decades operating on the theory that a formal hierarchy, director, signatory, accountable officer, was itself a kind of safeguard, that the weight of the title created a corresponding weight of responsibility in the person holding it. I told colleagues, more than once over the years, that good structure makes bad behavior visible, that if you build your organizational chart correctly, the incentives simply align themselves. I believed that so completely that I never once asked myself the more basic question sitting underneath it, which is that a title only creates accountability when somebody, somewhere, is actually watching what the person with the title does. I had built the chart. I had never built the watching. What I stepped back to do, in the 2 years after promoting her, was exactly what I'd always told younger managers to do, once they'd built a competent structure beneath them. Focus on growth rather than operations. I spent those years courting new clients, flying to trade conferences in Singapore and Ho Chi Minh City, expanding the supplier network on the sourcing side, while she ran the day-to-day movement of goods through Lat Krabang. Revenue grew steadily across that period, which, I want to be honest, matters to this story. Because a business that's visibly failing gets scrutinized, and a business that's visibly succeeding gets left alone. Our numbers, on paper, looked like a logistics company doing exactly what a well-run logistics company should do. I had no reason, by any metric I was actually looking at, to look underneath them. I want to describe the shape of a typical week during that period, because I think the ordinariness of it is the actual point. I would fly in from a supplier trip most Mondays, spend Tuesday and Wednesday morning reviewing the summary reports Supawati had prepared over the previous fortnight, sign off on whatever required my signature alongside hers for larger transactions, and spend the rest of the week on client development, sourcing trips, or simply enjoying a version of semi-retirement that felt, at the time, entirely earned. The summary reports were clean, well-formatted, and consistent, quarter to quarter, in a way that, looking back, I now understand should have prompted more curiosity rather than less. A genuinely messy, growing logistics operation produces messy numbers some quarters, a delayed shipment here, an unexpected customs cost there. Ours were almost suspiciously tidy, and I mistook that tidiness, at the time, for competence rather than curation. There was a quarterly board-style review I insisted on holding, even though our Thailand operation was small enough not to strictly require one, a habit carried over from the Melbourne business. And I remember those reviews as some of the more satisfying meetings of that entire period. Supawati would walk me through client acquisition, cost efficiencies, supplier renegotiations, and I would leave those meetings feeling, genuinely, that stepping back from daily operations had been vindicated by the numbers in front of me. I have gone back, since, and reread my own handwritten notes from 3 of those quarterly reviews. And what strikes me now isn't anything she said that was false. It's how many of my own questions, in those notes, were about growth and expansion rather than verification. Asking how we might scale a particular supplier relationship rather than asking to see the underlying dispatch paperwork behind the figures she was presenting. The first thread, if I can call it that in hindsight, without pretending I understood its significance at the time, came from a long-standing supplier of packaging materials out of Chonburi, a business I'd dealt with personally for years before Supawati ever joined the company. Their accounts team called our office one afternoon. I happened to answer the phone myself, which in itself was unusual enough that I remember the specific irritation of the woman on the other end, querying why two separate purchase orders, submitted within the same week, had used what looked like the same supplier reference code, but were being invoiced to two different company names. I told her it was probably a clerical error on our side, said I'd look into it, and then genuinely did not look into it for the better part of 6 weeks, because 6 weeks is exactly how long it takes an ordinary business owner to treat an odd phone call as noise rather than signal when everything else in front of him looks fine. I want to be honest about the texture of those 6 weeks, because I think the texture matters more than the eventual reveal. Nothing about that period felt alarming. Supawati was, if anything, more visibly productive than usual. New supplier relationships she'd apparently sourced herself. A couple of promising-sounding contracts she mentioned in passing during our weekly calls. The kind of initiative I'd always rewarded rather than questioned in any manager who'd earned my trust. I remember thinking, at one point that same month, that promoting her had been one of the better decisions I'd made in the whole Thailand venture, precisely because she seemed to be generating opportunities I hadn't asked her to generate. It did not occur to me, and I want to be plain about this rather than pretend some instinct was quietly nagging at me the whole time, that generating unexplained opportunity and generating unexplained liability can, from the outside, look identical for quite a long time. It was a business partner of mine, a fellow Australian named Craig, who'd put a modest amount of capital into the Thailand venture and checked in with me every couple of months, more out of friendship than active oversight, who actually pulled the thread that unraveled everything. Craig had flown in for a routine visit and asked, almost as an aside while we were walking the Lat Krabang warehouse floor together, why a specific batch of imported electronics components he remembered us sourcing seemed to be missing from the inventory count he'd glanced at on the shared spreadsheet the week before. I told him I'd have Supawati explain it, assuming, genuinely, that there was some ordinary explanation. A shipment delayed at customs, a reclassification in the inventory system, something entirely mundane. Craig, being an outsider to the day-to-day, and therefore less invested in the explanation being mundane, pushed slightly harder than I would have, and asked whether he could see the actual dispatch records, rather than just the summary figures. I remember my own reaction to Craig's question with more clarity than almost anything else from that week, because it was mild irritation rather than concern. I told him, half joking, that he was starting to sound like an auditor rather than an investor, and he laughed and said that was probably a fair criticism, but that he'd learned the hard way in a previous venture, that the moment a number stopped matching between two sources was exactly the moment worth being irritating about. I agreed to pull the physical records more to humor him than out of any genuine expectation we'd find anything, and I remember the specific, almost embarrassing confidence with which I told him, walking back to the office that afternoon, that he was about to waste an afternoon confirming a clerical error. What we found, over the following week of going through paper dispatch records rather than the digital summaries Supawati herself had always been the one to compile, was a pattern that took me several days to fully process, because processing it meant unlearning 34 years of assuming that summary figures compiled by a trusted director were themselves a form of verification. The physical dispatch records showed goods leaving our warehouse under our supplier codes that never appeared, in full, on our own sales ledger. Some of what left matched what we'd sold. Some of it, once you laid the physical paperwork against the digital summary side by side, simply didn't reconcile, and the gap between the two, once Craig and I had gone through several months of records line by line at his insistence, wasn't small. I remember sitting at my own kitchen table with printouts spread across it, doing arithmetic I hadn't expected to be doing at 63, and arriving at a figure, conservatively, of goods and diverted revenue totaling somewhere in the vicinity of 430,000 Australian dollars across roughly 14 months. Once I'd accounted for both the missing inventory and the client contracts that appeared to have been quietly redirected rather than simply mismanaged. I confronted her on a Tuesday morning in our own office, with the physical dispatch records in front of me, and I want to describe her response honestly, because I think it's the most instructive part of this entire account. She did not deny the discrepancy. What she offered instead, calmly, was that she had, in effect, been running a second, smaller import operation alongside ours, using overlapping supplier relationships and, in some cases, our own warehouse space and staff time, and that her husband, a man I had met exactly twice, both times socially, both times assuming him to be nothing more than a supportive spouse, had been her partner in that second operation from close to its beginning. She did not frame it, in that conversation, as theft. She framed it as a business she had built using the skills and relationships she'd developed in her role. The same skills, she pointed out, not unreasonably, that I had hired her specifically because she possessed. I asked her, at one point in that conversation, whether she had ever intended to tell me, and she paused for what felt like a genuinely considered moment before answering that she'd assumed, given how much autonomy I'd granted her, that I either already understood there was a second operation running alongside ours, or simply didn't care enough about the operational detail to notice either way. I remember finding that answer more unsettling than an outright denial would have been, because a denial I could have simply disproven with the paperwork in front of me. This answer required me to sit with the possibility that my own hands-off management style had been, from her side of the desk, indistinguishable from tacit permission. I asked her whether that was truly what she'd believed, and she looked at me for a long moment and said only that she supposed we would never fully agree on that point, which struck me, even in the heat of that conversation, as the single most honest thing she said to me the entire morning. I want to sit with that framing for a moment because I think it's the part of this story that has occupied me more than any other single detail since. I had hired her explicitly because she understood supplier relationships better than anyone I'd encountered in that industry, because she could build value out of a network faster than most operators twice her experience. What I had never adequately separated in my own head was the difference between hiring someone for that skill on my company's behalf and creating a structure where nothing distinguished her using that skill for me from her using it for herself. The signatory authority I'd granted her wasn't misused, in the sense of forged signatures or falsified documents, in the way I'd always pictured embezzlement working. It was misused in the much quieter sense that the same authority, the same relationships, the same warehouse floor and staff hours, had simply been pointed in two directions at once, and nothing in the structure I'd built had ever been designed to notice a single person operating in two directions rather than one. I engaged a forensic accountant out of Bangkok within the fortnight, a meticulous woman who spent the better part of 6 weeks reconstructing what she could from both our records and what she was able to obtain, through the appropriate legal channels, from suppliers who'd unknowingly served two masters using identical codes. Her final assessment, once every discrepancy had been traced and cross-referenced, put the total financial impact, lost inventory, diverted client contracts, and the operational cost of untangling which relationships were legitimately ours and which had been quietly annexed, at closer to 510,000 Australian dollars, a figure that took the better part of a year to arrive at with any real confidence. Because reconstructing a parallel business from the wreckage of your own paperwork is slow, unglamorous work with very few dramatic moments, and a great many long afternoons cross-referencing supplier invoices against a spreadsheet. I want to describe how I actually felt through that year of reconstruction, because I think it's genuinely different from what people expect to hear. I was not, for most of that period, consumed by rage, and I don't think that's because I'm an unusually calm man. I think it's because the part of me that had spent 34 years building operational systems was, almost against my will, fascinated by the mechanism of my own failure. I found myself, some evenings, going back through our old organizational charts the way you'd review a failed engineering project, tracing exactly which control point had never existed, which report I'd stopped requesting once I trusted the person compiling it, which single verification step, if it had simply been built into the structure from day one, would have surfaced the parallel operation within a quarter, rather than allowing it to run for well over a year. I built, almost compulsively, a kind of retrospective audit of my own trust, the same way I'd have audited a warehouse process that kept losing stock. Except the process in question was the entire architecture of how I'd chosen to run my own retirement. There was a particular evening, about 4 months into the forensic reconstruction, when the accountant sent through a set of reconciled supplier ledgers covering a period I remembered clearly as one of our strongest quarters on paper. I sat at my dining table cross-referencing her figures against the summary reports Supawati herself had compiled for that same quarter, and the two documents told almost identical stories on the surface. Same broad revenue figure, same general shape of growth, except that beneath the surface, nearly a fifth of what the summary attributed to legitimate client contracts had, according to the reconciled ledger, actually flowed through supplier codes tied to the second operation. I remember sitting with that specific piece of paper for the better part of an hour, not because the number itself was larger than others I'd already absorbed, but because it was the clearest possible demonstration of exactly how a summary report, compiled entirely in good faith by everyone reading it except the one person writing it, can look identical to the truth while describing something else entirely. I found myself, during that same period, unable to stop applying the same forensic lens to memories that had nothing to do with the numbers. A dinner 8 months into her tenure as director, where she'd mentioned, almost in passing, a cousin who imported small electronics and had asked whether our warehouse ever had unused capacity. A conversation I remembered enjoying at the time, because it felt like exactly the kind of resourceful networking I valued in her. A quiet week, roughly a year before Craig's visit, where she'd taken 2 days of leave for what she described as a family matter, and I recalled, only in hindsight, that the leave had coincided almost exactly with a gap in one particular supplier's delivery schedule that I hadn't thought to question at the time. None of these memories, examined honestly and individually, constituted proof of anything. What they constituted, taken together, was the specific vertigo of realizing that an entire parallel narrative had been running alongside the one I thought I was living in, using the same cast of characters, the same physical spaces, the same ordinary Tuesdays. Craig, to his credit, never once said the thing I half expected him to say, which was some version of "I told you so," largely because he'd never actually warned me about Supawati specifically. His contribution had been curiosity rather than prophecy, a passing question on a warehouse floor that happened to unravel something neither of us had seen coming. What he did say, once the numbers were finally settled, was that he'd seen a version of this pattern twice before in businesses he'd been involved with over the years, always in companies where a single trusted operator had been given both operational control and the summary reporting on that control, without a second, independent set of eyes ever reconciling the physical reality against the digital account. He put it more bluntly than I would have myself. "You built a company that trusted its own paperwork," he said, "and the paperwork was being written by the one person with the most reason in the world to make it look clean." Legal action against Supawati and her husband was, in the end, only partially successful, and I think it's important to be honest about that, rather than pretend the story ends with a satisfying reckoning. Some of the diverted inventory and contracts were recoverable through negotiation and the threat of formal proceedings. A meaningful portion was not, either because it had already been absorbed into the parallel business's own operations, or because establishing clean legal title to redirected client relationships across two overlapping companies operating out of the same physical premises proved far murkier in practice than it had seemed on paper. I recovered, across settlement and negotiated returns, a little over $200,000 of the total impact, which left a genuine loss, once legal fees and the forensic accountant's costs were factored in, of somewhere close to 340,000 Australian dollars. The Thai lawyer I engaged, a methodical man who'd handled a handful of similar commercial disputes over his career, told me early in the process that the strongest position I actually held wasn't the moral one, but the documentary one. The physical dispatch records Craig had insisted on pulling, records that existed independently of anything Supawati herself had compiled, gave us a foundation to negotiate from that we would not have had if we'd relied solely on the digital summaries she'd produced over the years. He was candid, too, about the limits of what Thai commercial law could realistically deliver in a case involving two overlapping businesses and a husband and wife operation that had, by the time we discovered it, already dissolved much of the evidence of its own boundaries. I remember him telling me, in one of our early meetings, that cases like this rarely end in the client recovering the full sum, and that the more useful goal was usually recovering enough to make the ordeal survivable, while ensuring the arrangement couldn't simply continue unaddressed. The settlement negotiations themselves took the better part of 8 months, mostly conducted through lawyers rather than in person. And I want to note, because I think it's a detail people rarely expect, that I never had another direct conversation with Supawati after that Tuesday morning confrontation. Everything that followed happened through intermediaries, a strange kind of anticlimax after a relationship that had involved daily contact for nearly 3 years. I found that absence, oddly, harder to sit with than the financial loss itself for a period. The sense that someone who had been central to my working life for that long could simply recede into a legal correspondence address without a single further word passing between us directly. I wound the Thailand operation down entirely within the year, not because it couldn't have continued under new management, but because I no longer trusted my own judgment enough, in that specific industry cluster, in that specific district, to rebuild the same kind of structure again, without a very different approach to oversight. I am back in Melbourne now, living comfortably enough on what remains of the original sale proceeds plus what I managed to recover, doing occasional consulting work for logistics firms who want an outside opinion on exactly the kind of operational risk I failed to see in my own company. There is something almost darkly amusing, and I say this with the dry humor Craig always accused me of hiding behind, in the fact that I now get paid specifically to walk into other people's businesses and ask the question I never thought to ask about my own. Who is actually checking the person you've trusted, and how often, and against what independent source? The consulting work has, in its own way, become a kind of ongoing education in reverse. I sat in a boardroom in Brisbane a few months ago, listening to a family business owner describe, with exactly the same unearned confidence I once had, how thoroughly he trusted the operations manager who'd been with him for 9 years. And I recognized the specific quality of that confidence immediately, because I'd heard it before in my own voice. I didn't tell him his manager was necessarily doing anything wrong. I have no evidence either way, and I'm wary now of projecting my own story onto every trusted employee I encounter. What I told him instead was the same thing I wish someone had told me before I ever handed over signatory authority, that trust and verification are not opposites, and that the healthiest structures are the ones where the most trusted person is also, without exception, the most consistently checked, not because you suspect them, but because consistency of oversight is the only thing that actually makes a title mean what it claims to mean. My second wife, I remarried 2 years after selling the Melbourne business, before any of the Thailand venture began, has been patient with me through all of this, in a way I don't think I've properly thanked her for. She sat through more than one evening of me redrawing old organizational charts on the back of napkins, working out exactly where a second signature requirement should have sat, and she pointed out, gently, some months into that process, that I was doing to my own grief what I'd apparently failed to do to my own company, which was finally paying it the close, consistent attention it had needed from the beginning. If there's a lesson in this that I think genuinely extends beyond logistics, beyond Thailand, beyond any one industry, it's that competence and integrity are not the same axis, and that a hiring process built entirely around measuring the first will tell you nothing reliable about the second. I hired Supawati because she was the best operator I had ever encountered in that specific corner of the industry, and she was, by every operational measure, exactly as good as I believed her to be. That skill was never the problem. The problem was a structure that gave enormous, unmonitored latitude to exactly the kind of person most capable of using that latitude invisibly, and mistook the title of director for a safeguard, when a title has never, in any business I have run in 34 years, been anything more than a label pointing at where the actual verification was supposed to happen, and in this case, never did. I think, too, about the specific comfort of semi-retirement, because I don't believe this story is only about oversight structures. It's also about the particular vulnerability of a man who has spent his whole working life being the person who checks, finally allowing himself to stop, and mistaking the relief of that stopping for evidence that stopping was safe. I wanted, after 34 years of building the first company, to be the kind of owner who trusted his people enough to step back, because I associated stepping back with a kind of hard-won seniority, a reward I felt entitled to after decades of being the one who never fully switched off. I understand now that stepping back and stopping verification are not the same act, and that I collapsed the two together because separating them would have meant admitting that true retirement, in a business built on trust, doesn't actually exist, that the checking simply has to continue, indefinitely, in some form, if the structure is going to mean what it claims to mean. I built companies for over 3 decades on the principle that a title is not a control. It took losing $340,000 in my own retirement venture to understand that I had, somewhere in the comfort of stepping back from daily operations, quietly stopped applying the one rule I'd built an entire career on. I don't know, even now, whether I'd have caught this sooner in a business back home, in an industry and a language I understood without translation, or whether the same blind spot would eventually have found me anywhere I let it. What I do know is that the version of myself who used to lecture younger managers about hierarchy being no substitute for oversight is, embarrassingly, the exact man this story happened to, and I've made a kind of uneasy peace with the fact that understanding a principle intellectually and actually living by it every quarter, without exception, turned out to be two very different disciplines entirely.